My name is Brian Wish. I'm an entrepreneur, CEO, and pathfinder. If I've learned anything in life, it's that self-discovery is a critical part of living intentionally, building meaningful relationships, and achieving the future we see for ourselves. In July of 2021, I sold all my possessions, headed west, and began a quest to live a fuller and more meaningful life. The experience helped me truly understand the power of a single moment. And through my conversations with leaders from all walks of life, I've seen how that one phone call, heartbreak, diagnosis, or lost job can transform the entire course of our lives. In this podcast, I sit down with entrepreneurs, influencers, and experts across industries to talk through the events that changed everything. Together, we'll relive the make or break decisions, hard conversations, periods of despair and hope, chance encounters, and everything that followed. For the past 3 decades, Charlene Li has been helping people see the future and thrive through disruption by advising executives and boards to recognize a vital truth. Companies can't simply innovate in order to stay competitive. They must transform. As a sought-after expert on disruptive transformation, leadership, customer experience, and the future of work, Charlene has worked with hundreds of organizations to provide her insights, supporting a winning strategy for disruptive growth and a plan to identify and seize an opportunity no one else has the audacity or confidence to reach for. Charlene's career has always been at the edge of disruption. In the early 1990s, she helped print media navigate the shift to online. As a principal analyst at Forrester, she covered interactive advertising, search marketing, and the rise of social media. In 2008, she founded Altimeter Group, a disruptive competitor that challenged analyst firm incumbents such as Gartner, Forrester, and IDC, which was acquired by Profit. Charlene went on to serve as the chief research officer at PAC Consulting, where she led the company's thought leadership program. Over a decade ago, Charlene found herself at a crossroads: stay at her stable job or strike out on her own and see what the future holds. Find out what path she chose on today's One Away Show. Charlene, welcome to the One Away Show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So Charlene, what is the one away moment that you want to share with us today?
I think the one away moment I want to share is after I'd written my first book, how I decided to leave the company I'd been at for almost a decade and to just strike out on my own with no clear direction of where I was going to go.
Okay.
So that was back in 2008.
And would love to understand the company you were at for 10 years, what you were doing, and then also the kind of fear behind or the excitement and opportunity ahead when you decided to make that jump. So maybe some context would be great for the audience.
Sure. I was at Forrester Research. I joined in 1999 and started covering internet marketing and media. And as you may know from the timing, that was the time of the dot-com boom. So I started covering the internet advertising, rode that entire trajectory, did all the online advertising projections that resulted in the dot-com companies getting their funding. So I raised my hand and take responsibility for some of that. And then went on to cover things like the rise of search, of social media. And in 2008, wrote my first book called Groundswell with my co-author, Josh Bernoff. And it was such a seminal moment writing that book. And going from after launching the book, going back to my job, I just went, I need to do something more than just continue to cover internet media and marketing. And so I was casting about trying to find a role or a place that felt comfortable for me. I wanted to write about bigger topics. And that just wasn't the direction that Forrester was headed in. And so I just decided that at that point, it was time for me to go. And that was incredibly hard because I was so happy there. It was a way for me to work and be intellectually challenged. I was constantly changing my coverage areas, which is not that usual for people to do. And I could also raise my family. My kids were very young at the time still. They were still in elementary school. And so I was like, I was consistently working 45 hours a week, doing a really high intense, very high profile job as an analyst. So, and I was going to leave all that behind. all of that security behind, all the healthcare and everything. And my husband was an entrepreneur at the time. So I was a source of stability in the family. So I knew I couldn't stay, but I didn't have an idea what I wanted to do. Was interviewing with people and nothing really struck me as the right formula. So I had a vague idea of starting my own company, gave my notice and left.
Wow.
And so that was, I had enough saved up to last me about a year. So I would go about 6 months and know that it would take me another 6 months to find a job if the first 6 months didn't pan out. So that's what I was looking at in July of 2008.
Okay. It's a big transformative shift personally and professionally. One question I have for you before we maybe talk about that shift is, you talked about being at Forrester. I mean, this, great job, challenging intellectually. When you look back on that period of time, right, even though it was time for something next, what would you take away? Like when you went into when you left, where do you think Charlene Li grew the most as a person that maybe you weren't expecting that ultimately maybe set you up for the next chapter in ways that you hadn't realized?
Well, I had started a newspaper group, an online newspaper group, before I joined Forrester at the community newspaper company. So it grew from me, one, to an entrepreneurial group inside a company. So stood up and it was about 40 people by the time I left and went to Forrester. So being an entrepreneur, starting things, and again, as an analyst, covering new topics constantly, I felt very comfortable trying new things. It's something that's new. This was different, though. This was completely heading out on my own. I didn't have the security blanket of a big company protecting me. I didn't have healthcare. For whatever reason, that was an issue for me. But I realized I had COBRA for 18 months. So I would at least have some coverage. Again, this was the days before we had a healthcare, a better system here in the US. Forrester was such a rich time for me. I had this tremendous freedom to follow whatever I thought was interesting. And it could be very creative because I started covering social media in 2002. I started a blog in 2004. My colleagues thought I was insane to be investing so much time on something that was clearly a fad and never going to go anywhere. But I could, again, this is what I think made me a good analyst. I could see where power is shifting. And so I developed that skill of being able to see how the future would unfold at Forrester. Mm. I had huge access to huge databases and most importantly, colleagues that I could work with to bounce off new ideas. So I knew I wouldn't be too crazy in the things that I came up with. That was a huge growth and confidence building for me. And especially having written the book that was supported by Forrester, I felt very confident that I could probably make my way in those.
That's amazing. It sounds like what you're sharing is you walked into this very welcoming environment that not only challenged you, but it provided a groundswell. It provided a lot of infrastructure and resources for you to learn, grow, and develop, and take on new maybe paths, and eventually transform yourself because of what it provided. Is that fair?
And also, it gave me the financial means to be able to strike out on my own, actually. Sure. Again, one of the things I think is so important, I write about disruption and transformation and about how hard it is to do this. And one of the things that enables people to take on disruptive things, to do hard things, is confidence. Because I believe that the difference between anxiety and excitement is confidence. It could, like getting on a stage and speaking for some people is highly anxiety producing. And for others like me who do this day in, day out, we know the things of how to do a good speech. It's exciting. It's the same sort of feeling, that's sort of like butterflies in the stomach, but one is channeled towards anxiety and one is channeled towards excitement. And the difference is simply confidence. And for me, starting out on my own in 2008, the hardest part of that was deciding to leave Forrester. That was the hardest part because I was so happy. It was like home for me. It was an intellectual home. It was an emotional home. My friends were there. I had deep connections to the company. I've been there for a decade. They supported me writing a book. I was so incredibly grateful to the company. And yet I could see that it wasn't going to serve my growth, my journey going forward. So that was the hardest part. Yeah. But once I decided to leave, oh, I could do anything. What do I want to do? And so, and my decision to go off on my own was built very much on the fact that I knew I would be okay no matter what the outcome. I knew that if I succeeded, that would be great. There'd be challenges that way. If it didn't work, I'd be okay. I could find another job. And so again, that confidence, but also just knowing that my options in front of me, that no matter what happened, I was going to be okay.
So I think what you said something so interesting and insightful, and I wonder if you would also say this is consistent with every transformation, personally or professionally. Up until you decide to like make the decision to transform, it's the fear of holding on to like what is, and then once you do like cut the umbilical cord, that sense of freedom, and maybe it's paired with some nervousness and etc. But there's that kind of feeling up until you cut the umbilical cord that's like letting go of like what is so good or what was, and then the swimming into the abyss in the fear, but also the excitement around it. Well, you say that's consistent in all types of transformation. I'd love your thoughts.
There's two types of change and transformation. There's the incremental change, where we're just incrementally changing a few things within our comfort zone. And then there's a change that pushes out to the very edge or out of our comfort zone. And that's where transformation happens. And you manage change very differently in those two situations. Incremental change, you just figure out what the change is, you develop a new habit, and you start working in that new way. Make sure that you're attending to that. I mean, it's just change management. That's classic change management. Transformation management, you're buckling in your seatbelt. You're getting ready for a jet propulsion ride because it's going to be crazy in some ways, depending on how disruptive you're going to be. Transformations do not happen without some sort of disruption. You think about the caterpillar going to a cocoon, becoming a butterfly. That's transformation, and that's extremely hard. You're changing yourself from the inside out. You have to prepare yourself. You don't just dive into this. You think about what are the difficult points going to be? What are the contingencies? How do I mitigate risk? And know that for a period of time, you're going to have to be prepared to handle a tremendous amount of change. So we go through changes like this all the time. But I think what you're tapping into, Brian, there are these epic moments of huge change that will make the difference in the rest of your life. You can take some time to decide that. Sometimes these things happen out of the blue. Sometimes we have a lot of control, other times we don't. What we can control is how we react to it. When change comes our way, whether we choose it or not, how do we prepare for it? How do we react to it? And you can choose to say, I don't want to change. I'm going to fight this. I'm going to stay in my comfort zone. Or you can look at it as like, it's an opportunity. Change is an opportunity to change, to grow, to transform. So am I going to take that on?
I appreciate we're getting like story of Charlene's life, and we're getting some textbook and your philosophy and true thought leadership here. So I appreciate the bridge. One more thing, and then we're going to bring this back to groundswell when you actually took the jump. I know we have a lot to get to here with everything you've transformed. You talked about transformation having different levels, right? I mean, read your writing in this, but I think that's also really interesting. Some transformations are tinier, some are much bigger. If you know you have that inherent feeling inside something needs to change, how do you decipher if it's going to be really big or the level in which you decide to transform? Love your insight on that.
Yeah, you could put boundaries, right? We all set boundaries all the time for ourselves to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel whole. And so you can say, I am going to change this much. And up to this point, I want to change. And after that, I'm not going to feel comfortable. And so knowing what your boundaries are is a super important thing to understand. I'm willing to change my job, but not move. I'm willing to move, but not change my job. It cannot impact my family detrimentally. I mean, whatever that boundary is, you have to set those things down. And that was one thing I did in 2008, is I sat down with my husband and to some extent with my kids and said, how are we going to handle this change? Again, I was the main person bringing money. I had the healthcare. I had 2 young kids. I was primarily responsible for them. And I was going to set up my own business. I mean, that's insane. I was well into getting into my 40s at the time. And so this is not a young, I wasn't a young whippersnapper with nothing to lose. I had a whole family. This is not your typical profile of an entrepreneur. And so I really had to set boundaries on how much change, how much transformation, what I felt I could tackle. And I knew that for the next year, it was going to be a crazy ride. And so I prepared myself and my family and asked my friends to support me along that journey.
Oh, I like that. The boundaries and like the planning. This isn't, like you said, this isn't just something you decide to jump into without forethought. If you're smart about it, you take your time to maybe understand, at least get your bearings on the things you're going to need for the road ahead, even if you don't know everything. Good to know. There's multiple ways to approach it. Now, I'm just curious, you decided to leave, you did cut the umbilical cord, you had a husband, you had kids. Like, what, if you could take us back to the moment when you were talking to your family, like what were their concerns, about you, 40 years old, going off on this journey? Like what were those conversations like on the home front? Because everyone, I mean, there's so many people, right? Like they hit that midlife moment at 40 or 50 and they're like, there's bigger pastures for me I got to pursue, but they have other responsibilities. So for you, like, how did you navigate that?
Oh, I had on top of it, my son had just been diagnosed as dyslexic, and his various doctors and therapists said, you take some more time. So it kind of corresponded with me having more flexible time to spend with them. So he was really glad. My kids were just happy that I was around more. That didn't last very long because I started getting busy and everything. It looked like a regular job again. But for this really short period of time, about 3-4 months, I was around a lot more. They thought this was great, and then I disappeared again. So, and I think that the thing for me was what I promised was greater flexibility. I would have a lot more flexibility and control over my schedule, and that has been true ever since. Because for the most part, I've run my own company, been on my own, I've been at companies where I had tremendous flexibility over my schedule, and that was paramount more than anything else. But I sat down with my husband, and I said, we looked at our savings, we looked at the timeline for that. And again, he was very familiar with entrepreneurs, being one himself. And so was very supportive of this adventure. He felt like, hey, I've had my turn. You should have your turn. And he was moving into a place where his income was a bit more stable. It still wasn't completely stable. It was better. So it just was a good time. But we, had to be really careful with our budgets. We carefully space out how the money was going to be used over 6 months, because some of it had to go into my startup and some of it had to go pay for just family expenses. And, it was tight, but we knew that we'd be fine. And that the worst case was after 6 months, I would start looking for a job again.
Yeah. And to your point, you had some more conversations. You looked at you analyzed the family kind of financials. You had the talks with the kids, but it seems like you put constraints around if this was going to work or not. So let's just say someone going down their own transformation. I mean, they're taking a big jump or a big gulp out of kind of life. How do you see constraints? You mentioned boundaries earlier, but just constraints, it sounds like that was important for you. Can you use constraints effectively to drive an outcome and the transformation you're looking for?
Any artist, any truly good athlete will tell you constraints are to your benefit. You only have so much canvas. You only have so much time that you can write a popular song. It's usually 2.5 minutes. Again, you can break those constraints every once in a while, but there are just generally constraints. An architect has only so much land and so many restrictions. And so knowing what your constraints are gives you a reality check, then allows you to be highly creative within those constraints. So I don't think constraints is a bad thing. I think they're a very healthy thing, because when you know what your constraints are and you're being very realistic about this, it allows you to be highly optimistic. I call it this mindset as being a realist optimist. So you can be optimistic about what the future looks like, but you also have to have a really firm grounding on what's really going on out there, what's really going on inside of you. And we always talk about leadership. The first thing you have to lead is yourself. And that is having an honest conversation with yourself. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? How are you going to fill those gaps? And for me in 2008, I set aside some key metrics I had to hit. I knew that I needed to get some initial clients. If I couldn't get any clients, then with the value proposition I had, I could try to iterate it, but I knew I had to get a base level of clients to feel confident that I could get more and build a business on it. I knew that I had to be able to create and publish research on my own. So could I assemble the team, the editors, the research people to be able to create that research? And I also knew, were there enough people out there who I could potentially hire who would want to come and help actually create a firm? So again, these were my entrepreneurial points to say, realistically, the whole first part of this formation page was saying, is this even feasible? And again, those are the constraints. I was trying to figure out what were my constraints. How was it going to actually work and pull together before I could start executing?
It's nice that you kind of you give yourself like the boxes that are like, hey, this is what's going to make a stable foundation. And, this applies to you, but applies to anyone. And it's not that transformation is so process oriented because it's disruptive in so many ways and unpredictable. But, I think that's an essence to what you're saying is you can make a transformation you decide to go down easier with certain mechanisms in place to navigate that transformation. So it's not a big mystery of the end.
It's interesting. One of the first things I did was to get a brand. Because what I realized that if I wanted to be an analyst, either independent or creating a firm, I needed a brand that was bigger than me. It couldn't be called Charlene Li Inc. It's because otherwise nobody would join me.
Yeah.
I also knew that it had to be a brand that stood for the kind of work I wanted to do. So I actually spent some of my cash and hired a branding firm to help me brand what I wanted to do. So I remember going on a family vacation and we decided to drive out to Yellowstone Park and camp. And again, this is 2008, not the best, most reliable internet connections at that time, especially in the middle of a national park. And I remember getting the first list of names sitting in a buffalo traffic jam because there's buffalo everywhere. They cross the roads and you have to stop. You can't run over them. And so I was sitting there in buffalo traffic jam, downloading the first initial names for my company while I was in Yellowstone National Park. And that's where it started getting really real for me. I was like, wow, this is going to be my brand. This is going to be the brand I want to build around. It's bigger than me. And in the end, our investment in the brand was what allowed us to be acquired. It's because the brand was bigger than me and it had a bigger brand than people bought the company because of the brand. I knew that from the very beginning, we had to have a strong brand in order to differentiate from the other firms that we were going to be competing against. And as an analyst firm of 4 people, we were competing against Forrester and Gartner and IDC, who had hundreds, if not thousands of analysts. And the only way we could compete against that was to have a strong brand.
As you always seem to do, you beat me to that next question of saying what was next. So you focus on brand, and this was Altimeter, correct?
Yes, Altimeter Group.
Okay, I was like, I better get this right. It sounds like you had this clear insight. Obviously, I need to build a brand and something bigger than myself, people around me to build and scale and eventually sell. Why the name Altimeter? Like, well, how did that connect to your kind of your vision for what the company ultimately ended up becoming?
Yeah, the creative brief was that we want to be able to fly high and be able to see over the horizon to guide people. But we also wanted to fly close to the ground in that we were acting as guides to the people who are actually in the driver's seat. And so we eventually called ourselves, again, we're a navigation tool. We're the altimeter to help you fly high and low. We helped our clients who were the pilots fly safely through disruptive times and through disruptive weather, so to speak. So we had a lot of analogies around what we did in support of the people who were actually doing the work. So it was very client and customer oriented. It was very value oriented in terms of how we described ourselves. And again, it was a very fun and consistent theme. Our office was called the Hangar. We'd come and have, gatherings and come and land your plane in the hangar anytime and just come and visit, so it was a nice way to be able to talk about our role and our relationship to our clients.
Interesting. Yeah, it sounds like a very orchestrated brand from all the naming conventions. And for those that don't know you or who are listening to seeing Charlene for the first time, tell us about Altimeter. Kind of, I would love to understand the journey. Like, what were you doing? Kind of, how did you build it out? And like, what was the end point until you sold? And I know it's a big question, but
Yeah, I wasn't convinced that I wanted to start an analyst firm because I'll tell you, the worst job in the world, I think, is to manage analysts because you think about herding cats. Well, this is like herding peacocks. It's much harder. But I really believed in what we could build. And so set out to build a very disruptive analyst firm. Most analyst firms sell subscriptions. To get to the content, you had to pay, typically $20,000, $30,000 per person who could read those reports. And we decided to give all the research away for free, a completely different business model. And then we would make it up by having very specific offerings that were based on the research. And so everything was a design-led program based on specific client problems. It wasn't based on industry or role. We said, here's a problem. We're going to look at it very holistically across the entire organization because disruption does not understand departmental boundaries. So we were writing about highly disruptive things. In particular, we were writing about social media and then digital transformation, the mobile transformation. We were talking about the rise of the gig economy, again, supply chain transformations too as well. So we found people who had background or affinity towards that kind of work, either brought them in or trained them up and developed them to write this research. And then we created products based on those topics. So we figured if we could get 50, 100,000 people to read one of these reports, and on a good day at Forrester, if I got 4,000 or 5,000 people, that was a really, really good report. And we were 10xing, 20xing that number with our readership. So the likelihood that somebody in that group, the problems that we were addressing, it would ring true for them. They would basically pick up the phone or email us and say, have you been looking over my shoulder? Have you been in my boardroom? How did you know this is what was our problem? You need to get over here now. We need to talk to you. We need to hire you to bring in to do this work. And so it was all inbound marketing. So we had a salesperson and her job was to basically scope and close. It was not to go out there and prospect. We didn't start doing outbound marketing, I think, for about 5 years. And it was only when we said, hey, we should do some outbound marketing. So it was completely 100% inbound. We had a set number of products that were highly repeatable that would do assessments and also consulting around a very fixed model that was in that report. So we didn't have to make things up. And we could do the same thing every single time for clients. So we could just bring them through. It was highly efficient. As our biggest constraint was analyst hours. I could only ask an analyst to work so many hours between writing and delivering for clients and then just admin kind of work. So everything we did was to leverage analyst time.
Interesting. It's fascinating to understand. I mean, you've shared a bit of this before, but it's so interesting kind of coming from Forrester, kind of seeing the model, then seeing a new way for the model, and then the model allowing you to really kind of pivot around industries and the times of technology and shifts in the market. As the world changed and market shifts happened, and you started doing the way you delivered your products, was it the same product set kind of for each shift in like the market or research? Like I that's fascinating.
Yeah, again, we always started with an assessment. We really try to include maturity models. And so people would want to get rated and evaluated for their maturity models. And some clients came back to us every 18 months to get regraded. And we would update the maturity models and the scoring because the market would change. What was considered good 18 months ago is like mediocre. Yeah. And so the target is constantly moving. So we would stay on top of that research. And again, we would update and refresh it. And we were very fortunate. I mean, I just written a best-selling book on social media. And so what was the first topic we tackled was social media. We wrote more about this. The firm really launched in 2009 with 3 other partners. We wrote a lot about social along with other things. And we used social to promote it. And think about the timing, 2009, 2010, we were in the depths of the recession. And all the budgets were being cut around marketing. So marketers were interested. How do I use this thing called social to boost my marketing? And we were literally the only game in town. And so we grew like gangbusters in 2009 and 2010 in the midst of that recession.
Because you're ahead of the market and ahead of the future.
Yeah. And so you think about disruptions that happen, economic, worldwide, and everything. You think about like the pandemic. You could choose to deal with these disruptions by going back into the bunker and sheltering in place. Or you can say, wow, anytime disruption happens, new needs arise. New opportunities are being created. So the best thing you can do is to pop up, look around, see where those opportunities are. And that's exactly what we did in 2009. So where are the opportunities? Where are the pain points? And we're going to run towards those, solve those. And in a design thinking approach, you spend anywhere from a quarter to a third of your time just defining the problem. So we thought this was the problem up here. And then we go, oh no, let's dig down deeper. We do research. What is the problem here? No, it's not what we thought. It's like these tentacles are pulling out. And so the issue was not to center too quickly on what the problem was we're going to address, because it may not be the right problem. So we do interviews and talk to people and took a design process through actually writing the reports and doing the research, and then use the same design process to identify the products and the offerings that would be offered along with the research. So we developed those two hand in hand. And again, we could identify what that problem was, very specific problem. That was the one we're going to go after in the market. And we believe that there was an addressable market for that.
There's this internal transformation and disruption, and it's just either it kind of happens to you just because of life forces, or like you decide to make that change. But you had a business. It sounds like you were getting ahead of the market and kind of picking the transformations ahead of what was going to happen, right? And you could kind of be the lead domino and saying this is what is going to be changing. And you said, you talked about this design thinking process, but like, how did you, I mean, obviously social kind of came fast and you were in front of it, but what I've been so impressed about just watching is the continuity of like how you've stayed ahead of the times. Like it's a very clear through line, like when you just look at your body of work. But when you were at Altimeter, like how did you know? I mean, so there was social, I mean, there were other market adaptations. Like what goes in to like actually being able to predict where the market's going and the business landscape, and what's your way of analyzing that?
I always talk about how I learned so much from my clients and from talking to people. People like, thank you so much for teaching us all this stuff. And I go, thank you for teaching me so much. They're like, what did we teach you? And I go, you ask questions that have never been asked before, or you ask questions from a different perspective. And all those questions, all the conversations get filtered into this knowledge of the marketplace and what are the problems. So we can map out these landscapes of problem sets that are out there. And the issue here isn't to just find a problem and solve it. It's which problems are you best equipped to address? We knew there were certain things we were better at addressing than others. We did not want to go near supply chain. And then we hired an analyst who specialized in supply chain. So now we could go do that. But we went looking for a supply chain expert because we couldn't answer those questions. And so we picked the places where we want to play. And we picked places in many times where it was an integrative approach to a particular problem that our competitors could not follow us into. Because again, they were organized primarily by role or by industry. And this integrative, holistic look at disruptive issues just didn't exist in the marketplace. Yeah. There was a very influential book called Blue Ocean Strategy. And when I looked at the analyst space, it was this red ocean filled with blood and people, fighting against each other and fighting against each other. I'm like, I don't want to go into that. We're like this tiny little firm of just 4 people competing against billion-dollar companies like Gartner. Like, we're going to get just swallowed up by that. And I had seen so many other analysts try to go off on their own and start with a subscription model. I'm like, that is not the model to go after. What would happen if we gave it away for free? And they go, well, that's insane. Nobody does that. I'm like, exactly. But how would that business model work? Oh. So it was really rethinking the entire way an analyst firm would work. And it's not just a single person, but it was an actual firm with people and P&Ls. And so it was and a brand that we invested in significantly.
Hmm.
So we always looked bigger than we actually were.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you put, as you know, more than anyone, you put thought to things and give people useful information. Like, no matter how big your team is, it leaves a mark and an imprint. So it converts. I mean, obviously, you took a disruptive look at the way you built the company, which is kind of meta for kind of saying, "Hey, this is what is going to go be disrupted in the future." And then, I like the strategy of what you're sharing. We looked at this holistically. We hired and people outside of our skill sets, but that could represent the brand. When you were at the endpoint of selling Altimeter, kind of what did the company look like? Why the decision to sell? Because clearly there was another kind of personal or transformation ahead for you. But like, what was the endpoint for Altimeter when you're like, hey, this was served its run and I'm ready for what's next?
I was just tired. Again, if you have ever run something or been a leader for something, it is exhausting. You carry the burden of people's livelihoods on your shoulders. And you know what that's like, Brian. I mean, you need to make payroll. You need to make sure that people are happy, they're employed, that they are all working together nicely. And that's just exhausting. And what I realized was I didn't like managing. I like leading, but not managing. And I wanted to get back to the core work of writing and researching. I mean, that is the thing that drives me. The thing that sustains me in my work is seeing the impact on clients, on people who read it. It wasn't, wow, I ran a really good meeting today. My team is aligned. And when I realized that, I'm like, I'm in the wrong business. I need to find a way to exit and or bring on new people who could take on the management skills. So I actually went out to get a strategic round of funding. We had been we never took outside funding. So I said, I'm going to go try to raise money to get that kind of leadership in so that I can be relieved of that, because I do a decent job at it. It's not something that makes my day. And I wanted to have some funding to be able to bring in that leadership. And while we're doing that, one company reached out and said, we really like what you do, but we're not interested in making a strategic investment. We just want to buy you. Would you be open to that? And any good entrepreneur always has in their back pocket a list of conditions under which you would sell. So I took up that list, gave it to them, and they agreed, and we sold the company.
Wow. First off, sounds like great awareness and foresight on what you needed for you for the future and what you like doing. And that process ultimately led you to an outcome that maybe wasn't the initial plan, but created seems like a nice way to celebrate all that hard work building and leading something. So I didn't know that about you. It makes sense. I can relate in some ways. So Charlene, you, I know we have hardly talked about what you've been doing the last couple of years, but let's transition here. And also want to thank you for your wonderful source material you're providing here and storytelling. You have been in front of the next wave of AI and helping large companies really implement, strategies to transform their businesses and like really the wave of the future, right? That if you don't implement Gen AI and really change how you do things, you're going to get swept behind, right? What are you, right, as someone who's been behind so many disruptions with companies, people, yourself, what are you most excited about maybe with this next wave of when you look at AI as an analyst and you see the future, what excites you the most, maybe just like in the next decade or 5 years, right? As we're truly entering a whole new world.
Let me give you a little bit of insight by answering that by telling you what I wasn't excited about. Again, I pick and choose which trends I think is going to really make a difference. So I saw the internet coming back in 1993 when I was in business school, and like, oh, this is going to be huge. Again, just so you realize, the World Wide Web had not been invented. It was invented the month I graduated in May 1993. So I said, I need to go into newspapers because that's going to be highly impacted, and I want to be there at that front edge of disruption. So my entire career has been trying to figure out what the next wave of disruption is going to be and running towards it because opportunities were going to come from that. So saw the internet, saw search. Again, everybody, when I started covering search, thought, why would you pay for traffic? I'm like, of course you would pay for traffic, but if you're a big business, you don't think of it that way. So covered search, covered social, covered digital transformation, covered mobile. And when Web3 happened, I looked at that and I went, this is not going to be very big. When crowdsourcing happened, I'm like, it's going to be interesting. It's going to have some interesting dynamics, but it's not going to be that big. When crypto happened and, AR and VR is another one, I'm like, it's just not going to be very big. AI happened with generative AI. I'm like, oh, this is mind blowing. And the reason why the consistent things across all of these, the things that really become disruptive and change things, is that they change the way we relate to each other, the way we relate to ourselves. You think about internet, it was a complete power distribution of who could actually set up a store and sell, who could become a publisher and a creator. With social, it came down to the individuals and was a huge power shift between traditional holders of power now moving into individuals and consumers who could use social connections to literally overthrow governments. And with AI, it changes the way our relationship with knowledge. Knowledge is becoming commodified and democratized. It's no longer the domain of just a few people who have access to it. People at the bottom rungs of corporations of society now have access to knowledge that they could never have dreamed of and can now upskill and reskill in ways that is going to make them much more productive and efficient and contributing and have a great impact on them. And it's also anybody with a browser can use it. So there are no barriers to adoption. And yet, at the same time, because it is so disruptive, organizations that are built on existing power structures have a very, very hard time understanding and accepting that things are going to change. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of pessimism around AI is going to come to take our jobs, it's going to take over our world. And I think they're overblown. Yes, we have to be cautious. Yes, there are risks. There are things we have to be aware of. We have to be careful. But again, this sort of realist, optimist approach, I think, is the right way to think about AI. So hopefully that gives you a bit of insight. The way I think about the world isn't through the world of technology, it's through the world of relationships. And our relationships are changing. When we don't know where we stand anymore, that's when we feel disruptive and disrupted. Web3, AR, VR, gig economy to some extent, because it allowed people to make robust livings without having a single employer. But for the most part, those things were on the fringe. They really didn't impact how we relate to each other. So the trends I go after are the ones that are going to be gut-wrenching, disruptive changes because they change the nature of our relationships to each other.
You said something also, I think, very visual. Like something that sounds like when our feet go out from under us, or we're standing on ground that the landscape has completely shifted like so fast, and we're nowhere on a different ground, but we don't quite know what that means. And what you're saying is, it's not that you're a disruptor around technology. When at a human center level, our relationship changes to our environment, that's where you can kind of pinpoint disruption kind of happening on a broad scale. It's not just the technology, is what I'm hearing you say.
The technology is what's bringing about. It's the catalyst for this transformation that's happening. I mean, AI as a technology is pretty cool and amazing. The thing that's disruptive about it is that it will do your job for you the way you looked at your job. And so when it can do your job just as good or even better than you, then it calls into question, like, what am I? Who am I? How do I create value? It becomes existential.
Yeah.
And as a writer, AI can write with my voice extremely well. I can give it the prompts, give it my content, and it does a pretty darn good job of being me.
Yeah.
In the process of creating a digital twin that can actually sound and look like me, tap into my knowledge base, and answer the questions on this podcast, Brian, particularly. So,
that's right.
It won't do as good a job as me, but it'll do an adequate job.
Let's take two brands, two that you're very familiar with, just because the context of communities you're in. So let's take a brand like Patagonia, and let's take a brand like 1-800-Flowers. Major brands, world, or at least in the US, very known, some very known globally. If it's not a small and nimble company with 10, 15 people probably adapt to AI modifications very quickly. But when you're a size of and scale of, let's just say those behemoths of a company, where do you start, Charlene? Like when you kind of looking at a generative AI strategy or just AI macro strategy at large, like how do you wrap your mind? Like how do you help companies really think about the change, tie it to products, people, numbers, like that's a lot to really kind of come in and help a company with, but could probably save them or make them millions and millions more dollars, every year. So like, I would love your insight, how you tackle a problem, with companies of those sizes.
The way I think most companies doing it today is the CEO on the board gives it to the head of IT, CIO, maybe they have a CTO, and says, go figure what this technology can do. And work up all the use cases of where, and then we'll figure out where are some good, safe places that we can start experimenting with. That is the wrong way to approach it because it is highly transformative. And unless you start thinking about it from a strategic point of view, you're going to stay small scale the entire time. So the best way to think about it is to put together what I call the minimum viable team. This has the IT, but ideally somebody who's digital and AI, who can think about and understand what technology does and understands technology from a strategic perspective, not from a maintenance and infrastructure perspective, which is what most of IT does. You have somebody who is the highest level strategy person you can get to spend time on this. Sometimes it's a CEO, sometimes it's a head of strategy. You have somebody who can understand your customers and how they're changing and how their needs are going to be changed. Somebody, it may be the same person, who can look at it from a commercial point of view. And then you have HR, because it's going to change the way people work. And your workforce planning is going to have to change. You have those key roles on the small team, and then you look at your strategy and say, there's always a gap between where we want to be and where we are today. Let's take a realistic look at what our strategy is and how can AI help us plug those gaps? How can AI create competitive advantage for us? How is it going to help us achieve our strategic goals? That requires that small team understands at a visceral, individual, personal level how AI works and how it creates value. And the only way to do it is to get them to use it to transform the way they work themselves. And I'm a big believer you need to create a safe playground for AI to be used inside your organization so your information isn't leaking out and being used to train the model. You want to have those tools ready available for everyone and not just give it to everyone, but to that small group in particular, give them training and have them start using those tools to do the things they do every day, but see how it could be transformed. And it particularly is in writing and researching and using it as a sounding board or as a thought partner. And then as you're proceeding with the strategy, train your top 2 levels of leaders in the organization to use AI and to transform the work. Because until they see how it's transforming the way that they work themselves, they cannot begin to imagine how AI is going to transform the organization.
Interesting.
So we have what I call a knowing, doing, leading gap. We know about AI. Very few of us are actually doing it and using it. And until you use it, you cannot lead with it. So education, training is a top priority right now. And to focus on the strategic impacts of AI. Where can it create value in your organization? I can show you a chart of every single department, every single major role, and how AI can affect any of those roles. So there are so many ways that AI can impact your operations and give you transformational productivity and efficiency. But very importantly, how is it going to impact the customer experience? How is it going to transform what you do today? And the third thing you can do is to say, what new businesses and revenue models can you create because you have these core capabilities now that you could never have done before? Customer experience, internal transformation of your operations to become more operationally productive and efficient, and new revenue and business opportunities.
Interesting. So what you're saying is it starts internally. Obviously, you need the team strategy, get people using it, then doing it, and then it kind of transcends into the customer experience. And as you see the benefits, it opens up new opportunities for different models or businesses to be created because of
And you can just completely do it in a serendipitous way too. I know one company, SelectQuote, they were told, look, this is really dangerous. We're in financial services. Do not do anything that could impact our existing business until we can figure out what's going on. But go and experiment and do things that aren't going to impact the core. So they looked at this group of calls that were coming in, and they just weren't answering them in their call centers because their call centers were full and busy. And they knew from understanding just that phone number that this was going to be a low producing call. So they had a whole bucket of calls. And they said, what if we started answering them with a voice AI, but artificial intelligence with a virtual agent, answer those calls and just pre-qualify them? What if we did that? So they experimented, figured out what they wanted, got 2 contractors, and they built it in a week, launched it, and was generating $250,000 within the first month. Serendipitous in some ways, but also very strategic.
Right.
Given the constraints that where could they actually create value?
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, on a macro scale, I mean, probably tens of millions of dollars for some companies or hundreds of millions of dollars for some companies. And, but when you're, Charlene, when you're working, well, let's say with a company on this, right? And obviously, we're working with executives, but are you helping them assemble the strategy and like roll that, like, obviously if you can share names, great, but if you can't, but talk me through like that process. Are you going to like a mortgage kind of company or financial services? What does that, how do you arrive at that? And then let them go build that out, right? Because that's where the transformation is going to happen within the company.
Right. Again, I always think of things as a disruption curve. At the beginning edge of disruption, people are like, what is it? Educate me. How should I be thinking about this? So we're at that beginning edge still. People are trying to wrap their heads around it, but they're now moving past that. So I do a lot of workshops. I do a lot of training, education, a lot of keynote speaking to groups internally or to their customers. So a lot of my work is around that. But then they very quickly go, okay, I get it. And now I have to put together a strategy. And so I'll do workshops again that are very bespoke to an executive team to help them, again, look at their strategy, help them look at what AI is capable of doing and identify the top opportunities for them to investigate further. And so in some cases, I'll help them go through that investigation some more, help them find a consulting partner. Oftentimes we'll stand there and advise them over the next 6, 12, 18 months on a retainer basis to make sure they're staying true to this. Again, many of them have gone through some sort of digital transformation. So they're in a pretty good place to adopt it. The vast majority of companies are still somewhere in the true transformation part. They may have brought on a lot of the digital part, but they didn't actually go through a transformation of the organization. AI will be a forcing function for them to transform. There is no way you can adopt AI and have it have a strategic impact without going through a transformation. It will fundamentally change the way you work. It will fundamentally change jobs and career ladders inside an organization if you do it at a strategic level. It's going to change the way you have relationships with your customers and what it means to be a customer, how you're going to show up and engage with them. Again, changing all these relationships. So it's really helping these organizations understand the scope of transformation that could be potentially there and holding their hand and showing them a path where I'm not going to make it completely safe for you, but I can show you a way where you can wrap your head around it. You can understand the constraints and the boundaries you have to put in so that you can think rationally and realistically and still at the same time be optimistic about what this could be.
Love it. And it's like, it's an agile process and it takes time and you have to really wrap your hands around a lot of variables. Like you said, it starts at an individual level, goes to the team, and then transports into the org. And it must be fascinating for you to work with the tools in place and the teams and kind of continue to adapt on what's going to really make changes for, humans for the very foreseeable future and then some. So you said something about knowledge. Knowledge is democratized now. And we have access. And I was reading something the other day about drops in like applications to certain types of online educations or certain like education programs because of the barrier to entry is being significantly reduced because of information. I need to send it to you. What I love about your work is that you always are bringing it back to like the human and the person. It's not just companies go do the XYZ, but you really do talk about the human level. So with this democratized information, what do you see as the biggest maybe opportunity for advancement and transformation for an individual? And what do you see as the biggest risk to that, given the democratization of knowledge?
I'll give it the biggest risk, and this comes up oftentimes with my conversations with executives. Are we just going to get lazy? Are we just going to let AI do all the work for us of thinking? Because it can write for us, it can write the code. And it's kind of like the way we've gotten with map reading and all the maps, like Google Maps and Apple Maps. None of us know how to read a map anymore or to do wayfinding because we just depend on our GPSs all the time. We just have lost this ability to find directions and navigate. And where we lose the ability to write, where we lose the ability to think, to code, to create. And that is true. You could potentially get very lazy. That's a big risk. But I also think that it is going to relieve us of all the drudgery of things that we have to do, all the routine things that are just sort of a pain to get done. And it'll allow us to think more creatively, to connect more, and not have these administrative things, these routine things that are just sort of a hassle, get in the way of us being more creative, more connected in the work that we do. So I think that's the real potential is when knowledge and the routine tasks that knowledge can be used can be automated, or we can extend our capabilities with that. It allows us to be better humans, to be more empathetic. Again, these tools are incredibly empathetic. They can read us and they don't get tired, they don't get empathy fatigue. And they can also understand their biases up front. We like to think that we're better at all of these things. We're not necessarily better. And so how do we accept that a machine could do these things as well as we could? And that allows us to then say, what is unique to me? What is unique to us as humans that we can now go and tap into because we have the freedom to go do that now? We're no longer burdened. These machines can take on those burdenous activities that we have to do.
I love how you answered that. I couldn't agree more. I think there's an opportunity for a lot more creative flourishing and individuality with AI and people tapping into who they are more. And I mean, so many implications. But Charlene, this has been lovely. You have a book coming out. You're doing a lot of exciting things coming up. Tell us where to find you. Tell us, anything about the book you'd like to share, and tell us, what's ahead before we drop here.
Sure. The book is called Winning with Generative AI, the 90-Day Blueprint for Success. Right now, we're finishing it up. It should be coming out in October. Fingers crossed. So my co-author, Katja Welch, are excited about it. And it's great to have a co-author, especially someone who has her hands dirty. She's been in AI for the past 15 years, who was a chief AI officer before it even existed in any other place. So it's great to have a co-author like that. And you can find out more about it at my website, charleneli.com. You can see my latest writings there, connect, sign up for my various newsletters, and I would love to hear from you.
Well, Charlene, it's always a joy talking to you. I always find myself feeling a lot smarter when I leave you. So thank you, and looking forward to sharing this with our audience and hopefully your community. So thank you. All right.
Thank you again for having me.
Thank you for joining me on the One Away Show. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, please leave a review and follow us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Have a one away moment you'd like to share? Follow me on Twitter or Instagram at BrianWish_, or reach out to me on LinkedIn and tell me about the moment that altered your life. The One Away Show is produced by Arcbound, a company dedicated to helping entrepreneurs, experts, and visionaries launch authentic personal brands. From message development to podcast production, social media content generation, and book writing, we work with you to create your arc. Head to arcbound.com to learn more. Thank you for listening, and please join me next time on The One Away Show.